I was folding the tablecloth we'd used for our wedding reception when my mother-in-law's car pulled out of our driveway with 2 black trash bags in her trunk. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had coffee going. I had a load of laundry half folded on the bed. And I had, in my bag by the front door, a manila envelope with my name on it that I hadn't told anyone about yet, because I'd filed it myself at the courthouse at 9 that morning, before anyone else in this family was even awake. I didn't know about the trash bags until I went looking for the wedding album to scan a photo for my sister, who wanted it for a slideshow. The shelf in the hallway closet was empty, not rearranged, empty. I stood there for a long moment, and then I walked outside to the curb, because some instinct told me exactly where to look, and there they were. Wedding photos, our engagement portraits, a pressed flower from my bouquet, still in its little glass frame, cracked down the middle like it had been thrown rather than placed. I crouched on the curb in my work clothes and looked through the bag, and I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat back on my heels and thought, calmly, the way I think about a column of numbers that doesn't add up. She did this on purpose, and she did it today, and she has no idea what today already is. My name is Elena Voss. I'm 34 years old, and for 11 years I've worked as a forensic accountant, which is a fancy way of saying that I get hired to find the money people don't want found. Divorce cases mostly. Embezzlement. Hidden assets tucked into shell companies and offshore accounts and second safety deposit boxes rented under a cousin's name. People think forensic accounting is about spreadsheets, and it is, but it's really about patience. About the discipline of not reacting. You don't confront a man who's been skimming from the family business the moment you find the first irregular deposit. You wait. You build the timeline. You let him keep talking, keep spending, keep leaving a trail. Because people who believe they'll never get caught are the sloppiest people alive. I built my entire career on that principle. I just never expected to need it in my own kitchen. I believed, for most of my adult life, that love was a ledger you kept in good faith. That if you gave generously and honestly, the other side would eventually balance. I believed that quiet devotion was its own kind of proof, that you didn't need to keep score with the people you loved. That belief did not survive this year. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and one thing 11 years of forensic work taught me is that you never skip to the conclusion. You start at the beginning, and you follow every line until it either explains itself or contradicts itself. So let me start at the beginning. I met Julian Cross 9 years ago at a conference in Denver, back when I was 25 and still believed the world rewarded the people who worked the hardest and complained the least. He was funny in that easy, room-owning way, an ambitious junior architect who talked about buildings the way other men talked about sports teams, with real, unguarded love. I fell for him fast, and I fell for his mother almost as fast, because Vivian Cross had a way of making you feel like you'd been led into something exclusive. She hosted Sunday dinners with cloth napkins and real silver. She remembered how you took your coffee. She called me the smart one in front of guests, which I took at 26 as a compliment, and only understood much later as a label, a box she'd built for me and expected me to stay inside of. We married 4 years after we met. I gave up a partner track position at a firm in Chicago to move to Julian's hometown. Because his career needed the local connections, and mine, I told myself, could be rebuilt anywhere. I told myself a lot of things over those years. I told myself it was normal that Vivian redecorated our living room while we were on our honeymoon, as a gift, replacing things I'd chosen with things she preferred. I told myself it was normal that she called Julian every single day, sometimes twice, and that he always took the call, even at dinner. Even during arguments we were having about something else entirely. I told myself it was normal that whenever I mentioned wanting children, the conversation would somehow end with Vivian in the room, gently redirecting it, saying things like, "There's no rush, is there?" in a tone that made it sound like concern rather than control. The one person in that family who seemed to see me, really see me, was Renata Julian's older brother's wife. Renata used to slip me glasses of wine during Vivian's dinners and roll her eyes at the right moments, and for years I thought of her as the only ally I had by marriage. I want to be honest, though, because honesty is the whole point of telling this story. There were nights I'd catch something in Renata's expression when Julian complimented me, a flicker that didn't match the warmth in her voice a half-second later. I noted it and moved on, the way you note Anne. Odd transaction, and tell yourself it's probably nothing. Admiration and envy wear the same face for a long time before you learn to tell them apart. I wish I'd learned sooner. There were smaller warnings too, the kind that only makes sense once you've laid every entry side by side. Vivian had a habit of scheduling things on top of things I cared about. A spontaneous family trip the same weekend as my own mother's 60th birthday. A small gathering that turned out to be 40 people the same night as my firm's holiday party, the one year I might have made partner. Julian always framed these as coincidences, and for years I let him, because arguing about a coincidence makes you sound paranoid, and I had built my whole career on not sounding paranoid, on only speaking once I could prove it. So I didn't speak. I just kept a private, unofficial log in the back of my mind. The way you'd flag a client for a follow-up review, and I told myself that someday, if the pattern ever became undeniable, I would know exactly what to do with it. For 6 years, I carried something quietly that I never told anyone outside of Julian, and, eventually, our doctor. We'd been trying for a baby since our second anniversary, without success, and after 2 miscarriages and a battery of tests, I was the one who got the vague, inconclusive answers, the one whose body was, according to every hallway. Conversation and every sympathetic head tilt at Sunday dinner, the complication. Vivian never said it outright. She didn't have to. She'd bring up her own 3 healthy pregnancies at dinner, unprompted, and then look at me with an expression of soft, performative pity that I came to recognize as one of her sharpest weapons. I absorbed that particular grief and that particular shame for 6 years, mostly alone, because Julian changed the subject whenever I tried to talk about it, and because a part of me, the part trained to distrust, incomplete data, kept noticing that nobody had ever actually told me it was me. I just hadn't yet built the case to prove otherwise. What I found on the curb that Tuesday morning wasn't really about photographs. It was the final entry in a ledger I'd been keeping without admitting I was keeping it. 3 months earlier, I'd opened Julian's laptop to print a boarding pass and found a calendar. Invite titled Only with an Initial. Recurring every Thursday at a hotel 40 minutes outside the city. A hotel that happened to be 5 minutes from the office of a woman named Callie Poe, a junior associate at his firm whose name I'd heard him mention exactly twice. Both times with a carefulness that, professionally, I would have flagged immediately in anyone else's testimony. I didn't confront him. I did what I do for a living. I gathered everything before they knew I'd seen it. I want to walk you back through that morning in full, because the order of events matters. I woke at 5:40, before Julian's alarm, the way I had for the past 11 weeks of quiet preparation. I made coffee. I reviewed, one final time, the folder I'd built on a laptop that lived in my locked desk drawer at the office. A folder with bank statements, hotel confirmation emails I'd pulled through a joint rewards account neither of them had thought to check. Time-stamped texts I'd have legal grounds to subpoena if needed, and a spreadsheet. Because of course there was a spreadsheet. Tracking every withdrawal Julian had made from an account I hadn't known existed. An account funded, in part, by transfers from his mother. That was the detail that stopped me cold when I first found it, 3 weeks into building the file. Vivian wasn't just aware. Vivian was subsidizing it. $11,000 over 14 months, routed through a joint. Account she and Julian had kept open since his 20s, an account I had never once been told about in 9 years of marriage. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called a divorce attorney named Priya Shah, a woman I'd worked 2 cases with professionally and trusted more than almost anyone. And I told her I wanted this done cleanly, quickly, and with every asset accounted for before Julian or Vivian knew a single document existed. At 8:45 that morning, I filed. I sat in a hard plastic chair at the county courthouse in a blazer I'd chosen specifically because it made me look like I had somewhere important to be afterward, and I signed my name on the petition, and I felt something in my chest settle for the first time in over a year. Not joy, not yet, just the particular relief of finally acting on something you've known for a long time and refused to say out loud. I drove home. I made a second cup of coffee, and I went looking for a wedding photo for my sister, and found the closet shelf empty, and found the trash bags at the curb, cracked frame and all. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just took a photo of the bags on the curb, dated and time-stamped, the way I'd document any piece of evidence, and I carried the frame with the cracked glass inside and set it on the kitchen counter, and I waited for Vivian to explain herself. Because women like her always explain themselves eventually, usually by accusing you of something first. She called that evening, not to apologize, but to inform me she'd been doing some organizing and had assumed, since Julian mentioned things were rocky, that certain items were no longer wanted. I asked her very evenly which items specifically Julian had told her were no longer wanted. There was a pause on the line. The particular pause of someone realizing they've said more than they meant to. I told her I hoped she'd kept the receipts on her own belongings as carefully as she'd apparently been keeping tabs on mine, and I hung up before she could recover her footing. It wasn't a confrontation. It was reconnaissance. I already had what I needed from that call. Confirmation that Julian had been talking to his mother about our marriage's ending before he'd said a single word to me. The investigation, if I can call it that, had really started weeks earlier, in the quiet hours after Julian fell asleep, at a kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad, doing the thing I've done professionally for over a decade, following the money until it told the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. I pulled 18 months of statements across 4 accounts. I cross-referenced hotel charges with Julian's claimed business trips, and found that 6 of his 11 site visits that year had no corresponding entries in his firm's project management software. Trips that existed, according to the paper trail, only in his expense reports and nowhere else. I found recurring charges at a jewelry store downtown, a store I'd never once been taken to, for amounts that didn't match anything in our home. I found, tucked 3 folders deep in a shared cloud drive Julian had forgotten I still had access to from our old joint tax filings, a set of messages. Between him and Callie that had been deleted from his phone but never from the backup. People who think they'll never get caught leave the messiest trails because the whole architecture of their confidence depends on nobody ever looking. Julian had spent a year assuming that because I was quiet, I wasn't paying attention. He had confused my composure for blindness. It's a mistake I've watched dozens of guilty spouses make in other people's marriages. And it was strange. Almost clinically interesting to watch it happen to me from the inside. I built the file the same way I'd build any professional case. A timeline, first, with dates down the left column and sources down the right, so nothing existed in my head as a feeling, only as a documented entry with a date attached. Then a second sheet, cross-referencing his claimed locations against the GPS metadata still embedded in photos he'd texted me from the office. Photos that placed him, twice, at a restaurant 6 blocks from that same hotel. Then a third sheet, the one that took the longest, tracing the joint account Vivian had quietly fed for over a year, working backward through 11 separate transfers, each one just under the amount that would have triggered an automatic notification to my phone, which told me 2 things at once. That Julian understood our banking alerts down to the dollar, and that someone had taught him to think that carefully about not getting caught. I didn't have to guess who. But here's where the story stopped being simple, because forensic work rarely resolves into a clean villain and a clean victim. Buried in those old joint account statements, going back nearly 7 years, I found a recurring monthly payment to a fertility specialist's office. Not the clinic Julian and I had gone to together, a different one, out of state, billed under Julian's name alone, starting 8 months before our first miscarriage. I sat with that for 3 full days before I understood what I was looking at. I called Priya. She told me carefully that whatever this was, it belonged to a different kind of conversation than the one we were having about the divorce. And she was right, but I couldn't let it go, because the shape of it didn't match anything I'd been told for 6 years. The confirmation came from an unexpected place. Julian's father had passed away 4 years into our marriage, but his family doctor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor who'd treated the Cross family for 3 decades, had stayed close to Vivian, and it was Vivian's guilt, in the end, that broke the story open. Not to me directly, but to Renata, at a family barbecue I wasn't even present for. 6 days after the wedding photos ended up on the curb, Renata called me that night, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her, and told me everything. According to Renata, Vivian had cornered Dr. Okafor at the barbecue, half drunk on white wine and rattled by the divorce papers Julian had finally told her about, and demanded he just tell everyone it wasn't Julian's fault, not realizing, in her panic, that half the family was standing close enough to hear. Dr. Okafor, visibly uncomfortable, said he wasn't in a position to discuss patient information, but that he'd advised the family 7 years ago, when Julian's own fertility results came back, that the responsible thing was for both of us to know together, and that he'd been told, by Vivian, not Julian, that the conversation would be handled. It never was. For 6 years, I had carried a private, silent grief that was never mine to carry, reinforced at every Sunday dinner by a woman who knew the truth the entire time, and let me absorb the blame instead, because admitting the truth meant admitting her son wasn't the flawless heir she'd built her whole identity around. I didn't cry when Renata told me. I didn't argue, and I didn't call Julian. Not that night. I just sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear, looking at the cracked picture frame still sitting on the counter where I'd left it, and I felt something shift that was bigger than anger, a recalibration of 6 years of quiet self-blame all at once, like a spreadsheet where someone finally shows you the one formula that was wrong the entire time. Renata described the scene at the barbecue in more detail than I'd asked for, and I think she needed to tell it as much as I needed to hear it. She said Vivian's face went the color of the tablecloth when she realized how many people had heard. She said Julian's older brother had to physically steady his mother by the elbow. She said Julian, who'd arrived late, walked into the backyard mid-sentence and watched his father's oldest friend confirm, in front of 20-some relatives, the exact thing his mother had spent 6 years making sure I never learned. Renata said nobody spoke for almost a full minute. She said Vivian tried to laugh it off, tried to say Dr. Okafor was confused, and that nobody laughed with her. Renata told me one more detail I've never been able to shake. She said that in the silence after Dr. Okafor's words, one of the younger cousins, a girl of maybe 9 or 10 who'd clearly absorbed years of Sunday dinner commentary without anyone realizing she was listening, turned to her own mother and asked, loud enough for half the yard to hear, "So it wasn't Aunt Elena's fault?" Renata said Vivian set down her wine glass very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake, and walked into the house alone and didn't come back out for the rest of the party. Julian came to see me 3 days later. Not the house. I'd already changed the locks by then, well within my legal right once the petition was filed, but at a coffee shop near my office, at my insistence, on my terms. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking, which I noted the way I'd note any change in a subject's behavior. Information, not sympathy. He apologized for Callie. He apologized more haltingly for the 7 years of silence about the fertility results, and he said his mother had convinced him it would break me to know that it was kinder. To let me think it was shared, unexplained, no one's fault. I asked him evenly whether it had ever occurred to him that I might have preferred the truth to 6 years of quietly believing my body had failed us both. He didn't have an answer for that. He asked, finally, if there was any version of this where we tried again. I told him I understood why he did it. I told him I even understood, in the dry, procedural way you understand the motives behind a crime once you've read the whole file, why his mother did what she did, fear, control, a lifetime spent protecting an image of her son that had nothing to do with who he actually was. Understanding why someone did something, I told him, was not the same as forgiving it, and it was certainly not the same as staying. I said it once, plainly, without raising my voice, and I watched it land on him the way a verdict lands. Not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something he'd already suspected was true. The settlement took 4 more months, and I made sure it was fair rather than punishing, because I've watched enough ugly divorces to know that vindictiveness costs you more than it ever returns. I kept the accounting practice I'd quietly started building on the side during those 11 weeks of preparation. Julian kept the townhouse we'd bought together, which he could barely afford alone, a fact I noted without comment. Vivian tried, twice, to reach out to me directly, once with a fruit basket, absurdly, and once with a long voicemail about how families go through seasons. And both times I let Priya respond on my behalf, because some conversations aren't worth having twice. When the final papers came through, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I'd finished the last page of a book I'd already known the ending to for a long time, and simply closed the cover. It's been a 1.5 years now. I left the firm I'd worked at for a decade, and built my own practice, one that specializes in exactly the kind of work that got me through my own divorce. Forensic accounting for women navigating separations where the money has been hidden, minimized, or used as a leash. My first 3 clients found me through a single post in a local support group. I now have a small team and a wait list. The work looks different from the outside than it feels from the inside. To a client sitting across from me for the first time, it probably looks like I'm just reading numbers off a screen. What I'm actually doing is watching the exact moment a woman realizes she was right all along, that the thing she'd been quietly cataloging for years, the thing everyone told her was in her head, has a paper trail after all. I recognize that moment now because I've lived it. I keep a small framed note on my desk that one of my earliest clients sent me after her settlement closed. It says simply, "You believed me." Before I had proof. I think that's the real inheritance of everything that happened with Julian and Vivian. Not the practice itself, but the instinct to believe a woman's quiet certainty is worth investigating properly, instead of waiting for someone else to grant her permission to be sure. My mother asks, sometimes, if I'm lonely. I tell her I'm not, and mostly that's true. I've rebuilt a life that fits me instead of one I had to keep folding myself smaller to fit into. I see my sister every week now instead of every few months, because Sunday dinners are no longer scheduled around someone else's silverware. I go back to Denver twice a year, to the city where I met Julian, not out of nostalgia, but because a colleague there refers me cases, and it feels like a fair kind of symmetry, using the place where that whole story started as a source of new work instead of old grief. I still keep that cracked picture frame, glass and all, on a shelf in my new office, not out of sentiment for the marriage, but as a reminder of the morning I stopped waiting for someone else's version of events and started building my own file. Some of my clients ask me why I keep it. I tell them the truth, because I want to remember exactly what it looks like when someone tries to erase you, and exactly how little power that has once you've already done the one thing they didn't see coming. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's refusing to carry their lies any longer than the truth requires. I think about that Tuesday morning often, the trash bags at the curb, the manila envelope already filed, the quiet math of a life finally balancing. I think about how close I came to never opening that laptop, never pulling those statements, never asking the one question that unraveled 6 years of unearned guilt. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Vivian had simply left the photographs alone. Would I have found the rest of it anyway? Would Renata have ever made that call? I'd love to know what you think happens to Elena next. Does she ever let anyone else in? Or does she stay guarded for good? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if this story kept you here until the end, hit subscribe. Because there are a lot more women out there with files like mine, and I'm going to keep telling their stories too.